far, I'm going to go ahead and remember to hit the record button. So just letting you know that this session is being recorded and maybe posted on our BlazeView 101 training session for people who weren't able to attend in person. Okay, so this workshop is gonna, there's like a few sort of key components that we're gonna get through in the next just under an hour now. I started off with kind of a temperature check just to get a sense of the room and where everybody's at, and some welcome information. That's the part that we're in now. We'll spend a little bit of time thinking how we can integrate course policies into a universal design for learning framework. We'll together reflect on the needs of a diverse student body here at VSU. I'm going to go over the Pandemic Pedagogy Survey that Academic Affairs sent out to faculty members last year about the sort of lessons learned and different other sorts of feedback from this last year of teaching. And then we'll finish by really sort of trying to dig into the nuts and bolts of different policy options that you might try to take up depending on your different class. So you'll see that the learning outcomes for this workshop kind of follow directly from those sections. We'll be integrating attendance and late assignment policies, reflecting on the needs of the student body, contrasting the responses in the pedagogy survey, and then assessing how different course policy ideas align with the integrated framework that we had for course policies and universal design for learning. Okay, so this is the summary of the workshop that was put out with the flyer, the different information that we sent out about different workshops that CELT's producing during Welcome Weeks here. And I won't go through the whole thing, but I do want to highlight one particular sentence that I wrote towards the end and a couple of word choices. I mentioned that part of this sort of my thinking around these different policies was how to maintain a rigorous classroom environment while also maintaining flexibility and understanding for both students and faculty members. And I know that in my discussions with other faculty members, that a lot of people sort of think of these two ideas as in conflict with one another, and that having a sort of rigorous classroom means reducing the amount of flexibility, sort of being stricter with your students. And this is a big part of what I want to do today, is to kind of disassociate these two different terms and think through how you can maintain a rigorous classroom while also providing flexibility. And I'll admit at this point that when I began with asking you all some things that you feel sort of behind on, some things that you're are causing you anxiety as we approach the start of the semester, that I did have an ulterior motive. I am, of course, interested in your well-being and wanting to check up on you. But one thing that I found is that professors are the perfect example of how you can do rigorous work while also having some sort of understanding and flexibility in your own job description. So I know that by definition, I don't think anybody would argue that the work that faculty members do is rigorous. I think it's sort of by definition, it's built into the field. But certainly there's some flexibility built in. So if, I know a lot of people have late journal articles or they end up starting the semester with a few weeks where the readings are still TBD. And these things are okay. It's understandable. I know in my own work, before I gave this workshop last week, I was finalizing some of the details, and I had meant to finish it by Friday, but some things came up. I had faculty reach out some specific questions, and I wasn't able to get it done at the time that I had said I wanted to get it done. So I worked on it over the weekend, and I got it done, and everything was fine for the first version of this workshop last week. And then since then, I actually ended up getting kind of a sniffle and starting to having not exposed my immune system to society in over a year, practically. Once I finally kind of broke free of that shell a little bit in the last couple weeks, and now I'm closing back up again, but that's another story. I did catch a little bit of a cold bug, not enough to keep me from working, but enough to keep me from coming in and risking spreading that to my coworkers. And so I ended up working from home. And these bits of flexibility, I don't think impact the quality of the work that I do, and I don't think it impacts the quality of the work that you do. And so certainly I think that this is a good example of how you can do rigorous work while maintaining flexibility for needs that come up for different adults. So that's kind of one of the big emphases I want to have with this workshop. Okay, so I want to turn it over to the two of you here. If either of you have heard of universal design for learning, or have perhaps some ideas, like what do you think of when you think about universal design for learning? I'm curious to kind of get what your first impressions are before I share some thoughts. So if either of you have heard of it, you want to take a stab at trying to define it, or offering some examples of things that would fit into universal design for learning, I think I'll pause for a minute here and see if I can get some feedback from the two of you present.
So I haven't heard anything about universal design for learning. This is new for me.
Okay, great.
Um, when I think of that, I just think about the learning environment and the spaces. I know that we have different learning individuals, so everybody learns differently, and I do think the environment impacts what's conducive to learning.
Great, thank you. So I'll say that a brief background, because Shipra hasn't heard of UDL, and that's totally normal. It's actually an idea, it's a philosophy of that originated in like an architectural sphere, which was just the idea of universal design, and it was that you should build buildings accessible from the start so that people don't end up needing to ask for accommodations or special assistance. And so this idea of just building accommodations in from the beginning was then applied to education for learners, and the same principle applies. So like build your course from the start to be accessible for a variety of different learners. And so most people, when they think about universal design, I think their first reaction is to think about things like making legible fonts, right? Not having slides that have colors that are difficult for people with color blindness to see, having accessible like PDFs that readers can read, right, rather than photos. So a lot of sort of accessibility of course materials. But one of the things that I really like about this definition in Reach Everyone, Teach Everyone by Tobin and Bailing, and here I'll just read it. UDL, that's Universal Design for Learning, is a way of thinking about creating the interactions that we have with our learners so that they do not have to ask for special treatment, regardless of the types of barriers they may face, time, connectivity, or disability. And what I like about this definition is that it emphasizes interactions. And interactions is not a specific word, it's a general term. It applies to things like our the materials in our class, the place and time of our meetings, things like the content of your course policies. All of these things are part of what it means to interact with your students. And so I've kind of taken this idea of accessibility of course materials and tried to apply it, the principles of that, to designing course policies. Specifically today, we'll talk about late assignment and attendance policies. But this is what universal design for learning essentially means, is not having to have people ask for accommodations. And I think it's fair at a certain point to ask, why do we need to preempt these accommodation requests? Why can't we just be accommodating when somebody comes up and asks for something? And there's kind of 4 reasons why I encourage people to try as best as possible to preempt these accommodation requests. The first is that seeking accommodations is itself a barrier to learning. Frequently going through the full process of asking for and getting access to specific accommodations is kind of a lengthy and onerous process. And more importantly, perhaps, is that it doesn't really help in emergency situations. So that process is good for people who have like learning disabilities or some kind of thing where they need perpetual accommodation. But if something just comes up, it's easier to just have flexibility built into your course rather than needing to have people sort of go in and ask for accommodations or seek out sort of assistance later. And so building flexibility in does a better job of accommodating students in emergency situations. The third reason is that it creates more equitable outcomes for all students. So the research suggests that especially first generation college students, but also students from other um, uh, marginalized communities and lower represented communities tend to ask for accommodations less than um, other students. And so they'll be less likely, for example, to ask for regrades, less likely to ask for delays, right, or extensions on assignments. And so I know that some faculty members, they'll put in their syllabus sort of strict policies, but then they'll tell me that I'm really accommodating when somebody comes to me with a concern. And what I tell them is that this process of having sort of strict policies listed in your course design, but then being accommodating to students who ask for help, can actually exacerbate some of the barriers that sort of distinguish different groups of students in our student body. And so we might unintentionally be widening the gap between students that come from families that have had generations that have gone to college, and those who are first generation college students, for example. And so it tends to, you'll get more equitable outcomes. That is to say, if you just build the flexibility into the actual design rather than making decisions on a case by case basis. And the fourth reason is that it actually makes your life easier in the long run, both for you and for the students. One of the things that I want to focus on here, and you'll notice that part of my description was about meeting the needs of both students and faculty, is that you can create policies that are going to end up giving you fewer emails to respond to, right? Fewer requests for extensions. If you build flexibility into the design, then you have fewer students that sort of need special accommodations later that you then have to sort out, right, as the semester progresses. So here what I want to do is just take another minute, and I know that you've already gotten comfortable with the tools to add text or to different boxes here. So I want to take a minute to just kind of reflect on student accommodation needs. And I want you to think about this sort of more broadly than just sort of accommodations, but like what things can come up that would require, that might make it harder for a student to sort of succeed in your class. And you'll see that I've split things into kind of two different categories here. So you can put things that are kind of specific to this moment in time, related to sort of being in the pandemic, or things that are just kind of evergreen, that are always existing here. And I'll give a few minutes pause, and feel free to add a few or maybe one or more to each side of this list ideally, and I'll try to think of some myself as well. I've seen lots of great things. Thank you for sharing here. We'll give it another minute or two. I know that we could do this all day, but I just want to kind of hit at some core issues. Okay, so let's take a look. We have things that are specific to this moment, right? So things like needing to quarantine because you were exposed or tested positive for COVID, um, having sort of developed a habit of being online and at home. Um, this is especially true, I think, for incoming sophomores whose first year was predominantly in an online environment. Things that, grief, right? Even if we were in truly more of a post-pandemic situation, the original scare quotes around post, I was hoping that we would be kind of tailing out of this particular pandemic. Obviously not clear of it, but certainly things looked better a month ago when I started thinking about this. But even if that was true and things continued going well, people lost a lot this last year, and so that like emotional toll carries on even past the sort of situation where things are sort of being ravaged in your community. So limited access to resources. These are all things that are specific right like now. But one of the things that I wanted to emphasize with this part of the presentation of the workshop is that even outside of the context that we're in right now, there's always stuff that comes up, right? Like that's part of being an adult. If you can have car trouble or family trouble, and lots of students have to work, right? And like if their job might require them to come in, like they had set everything up to have their schedule cleared, and then an emergency comes up and they have to show up to work for one reason or another. Bills, different things around sort of disability. These are all things that are perpetual, right? And so there's a sense in which some of the things that we want to do in terms of being flexible and accommodating are dependent on this particular moment. But some of the things are perpetual, right? And so it's useful to think about what policies we might want to just make the norm as we move forward from this moment. So thank you both so much for contributing to this list here. Let's see if I can actually take a screenshot of that. Great. Okay, so I want to highlight a few things from the research. There's sort of really strong evidence that attendance and performance issues are really highly associated with students who are suffering from sort of physical or mental health problems. Students who are disadvantaged economically are far less likely to sort of have consistent attendance. And sort of instability in your home can create a sort of major obstacle. And that's true both if you're sort of a younger student, you're still living in it, with your parents, your family, or if you're an older adult learner and you might have children of yourself who could get sick or different things like that that might come up, right? Those are all issues that our students, different kinds of, having a diverse student body sort of creates. And so, I highlight some of these studies on the causes and consequences of poor attendance and performance in classrooms, but I don't want to give the impression that I'm naive, right? Like I know that on a college campus, some of the times that people are absent, right, it's because they're, perhaps not putting in maximum work, or it's they're hungover or whatever, right? It's a college. I recognize that you might have like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, and everybody comes on Monday and Wednesday, and suddenly every Friday the class is half empty. I recognize that not all of it is just structural barriers or emergency things coming up. But the question that you have to ask is, do you want to build policies that sort of try to constrict these students who might be taking advantage of your sort of flexibility, but in doing so you might accidentally create barriers for people who are trying to do everything right and struggling, and so it's a balance, right, that you have to reach. And where I come down on it from a philosophical standpoint is a belief that for me, it matters more to make sure that I'm being accommodating to the student who has the highest needs. And if there are some other students who take advantage of that flexibility, I try not to worry about it and to focus on what students you are reaching, right, by building an inclusive and accessible class for them. And so, I don't know if that works, if that's comfort for anyone, and I know it's hard to see students sort of take advantage of your generosity and your flexibility, but there's going to be a trade-off one way or another. So I just don't want you to look at this and think that I'm naive as to why some students aren't there, but there's definitely, yes.
Brian, I have a question.
Sure.
When we are talking about some students who might be taking advantage of these like flexible policies, and you said I tend not to worry about them, and that's true. But I am having a hard time accepting like this kind of behavior. Not just this, like even for the academic dishonesty. Like some people told me, if they cheat, let them cheat. It's their, they're not gonna pass the exam. But you see, the problem is that I would have let it go, but uh, the way your class grades are, like in at least in US education system, it is like it reflects on the professor, the teacher. So like there, if there are like a lot of students who have these behavior problems, and if they're failing because of that, if I do not care about them, then it's going to reflect on the grades.
Thank you. I'm a little confused. So if what I'm trying to suggest is that it's ideal to build policies in that have more flexibility so that you are helping the students who are struggling the most. And you might end up with some students who take advantage of those policies. And when we get to the actual specific policies, I think that it might get a little bit clearer there. But they wouldn't end up doing poorly in the class. I think if anything, they'll be taking advantage of your flexibility to do better. But my whole thought is, make sure that we're building something that sort of sets a floor for the people who have the most needs, and focusing on them first, and being a little less concerned about, for example, somebody that perhaps turns something in late that they didn't need to, or takes advantage of an attendance policy that lets them miss a handful of classes. And they're doing it not because an emergency came up, but just because you let them, right? So I'm not sure exactly. I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Sorry, yes, that was my concern. And you said to achieve a balance. So I'm actually looking forward in this workshop how to achieve that balance.
Okay, so let's go ahead and carry on a little bit here, and then I think when we circle back to some specific policy ideas towards the end of the workshop, we'll make sure that we can kind of address that. But I think as we go through this pandemic pedagogy survey, the idea of balance, I think perhaps might come into clearer view. And so Academic Affairs sent out a survey. It asked faculty members last year, what they wanted to start doing in the post-pandemic sort of classroom, what they want to continue doing from the last year, and what they want to stop doing. And reading through this feedback, I've shared just a handful of the feedback on this slide. There's a lot more. I started to notice patterns as I looked through it. So the first kind of theme that I noticed was this sort of strong desire to return to like what I'm calling like a return to normal, which is whether or not that's just because faculty members have a preference for face-to-face pedagogy, or whether they just really, really didn't like doing high flex. I think who's to say, really. But one thing that I do know is that I believe that you can run an online class and you can do it great. You can do a great job teaching an online class, especially for specific disciplines, right? It might be harder in other disciplines. But for lots of classes, you can do a great job teaching online. But I know that we asked faculty members that had designed classes to be in person to sort of quickly transition to online. And that was in an emergency, and that's very different than designing a class online from the start. And so this was a big ask, and we put a lot on faculty members in the last year. And I think broadly speaking, you all did a great job of reacting to the needs of the students, and rose to the challenge, right? So, but for those of you who weren't used to teaching online, this was a really stressful, challenging, and overworked year, which kind of, I think, leads into the second theme, which was this idea of self-care, right? And it was both for the students and for faculty, a need to sort of take a step back from how much, in particular for faculty, like I know faculty members who really bent over backwards to be accommodating this last year, even going so far as to like allow any late submission as long as it was turned in by the final, right? And to be willing to grade that, and just taking on tons of burden for themselves, right? And I think that that's an incredibly generous, but also certainly onerous policy to sort of take on. It might not even be ideal, right? Moving forward, it was a policy of the time where, moving forward, you in some ways you could set your students up for falling really far behind in the class, right? Or being unable to sort of contribute to discussion if they're letting everything fall behind. And so that was kind of a policy designed for the moment, that might not be sort of something you want to carry on and move forward. But the third theme is, and sorry, before I move on, this is one of the things where I want to step back. Like, I don't want to ask for policies that are going to make life way harder for faculty members, because I recognize that what we're all coming out of from this last year plus was super challenging and demanding. And so how can we strike the right balance, right? And I think that we'll get into that here in just a sec. The third sort of theme was, for lack of a better term, what I'm calling the being more strict theme. And I think that this comes out of the first two, right? A strong desire to return to normal, and a need for sort of like more self-care, right? But one of the things that I hope, comes out of this moment is a recognition that our students are resilient, and that if we give them just a little bit of flexibility, that we can sort of see them succeed, and become the kind of scholars and leaders that we all want. So the fourth thing that sort of stuck out for me reading through the Pandemic Pedagogy Survey was actual specific policy recommendations that come from your peers about things that they've done. And so I'll highlight a few of them, and I welcome sort of suggestions from you both as well about things that have worked for you, and we'll have a little discussion afterwards. But the first policy that I want to emphasize is a flexible late assignment policy, or like a grace period, no questions asked after an assignment due date. And this is one that I particularly like. The last time I taught a class, I used this with great success, where I ended up minimizing significantly the amount of sort of emails that I got about sort of extensions or delays or regrades over assignments. And so I'll explain a little bit about how exactly I put that into place before we kind of cover some of the other topics here. What I ended up doing was putting in the syllabus a little bit of like almost like a preachy type thing about sort of maintaining work-life balance for my students. And so what I said was, all of the assignments that you have for each week, I sort of made each week into a module. And I said, all of the assignments that you have for the week are due by Friday at 5 o'clock, at 5 p.m. Because you deserve to have a weekend where you can sort of socialize with friends and family, and pursue hobbies, and sort of rest and recuperate and get ready for the next week, right? All of the things that we expect as adults to have for ourselves, I wanted to sort of try to help build those habits for the students as well. But I also said that things come up, and so I won't accept or you won't have any sort of late penalties so long as it's submitted by the end of the weekend, by Sunday at 11:59. I coupled that that specific policy by also saying I don't accept work after that point. So don't don't put things off until the last minute, because I'm not going to take work after the end of the weekend. and the sort of catch, the thing to help protect students from that, which is kind of a strict policy, but which protected me as the instructor, was allowing them to drop the lowest score from their assignment group. So for discussions or quizzes or different things like that, I said, okay, this is a condensed summer school class. And so there was only like 5 of each. I said, I'll drop you the lowest quiz score and the lowest discussion board sort of response score. And you have this 2.5 day sort of grace period where you can submit things without any questions asked. And that won't be sort of scored poorly, but I won't take anything other than that, right? If you missed the Sunday deadline. And I didn't get an email from my students, asking for extensions. And almost all of them only had one missed assignment or none for the quizzes or the discussion boards. And so they weren't super penalized. It reduced my workload, and it sort of provided that flexibility if something did come up for the students. Now, I know that this isn't a new idea. Other people have talked about it. And when I gave this workshop last week, I had a lot of pushback on this, where some faculty members said that, they've tried this and then that just becomes the new deadline, right? Sunday at 11:59 becomes the new deadline, and you'll still end up getting emails on Monday asking for extensions. And so I want to just kind of highlight a few strategies that I use to kind of minimize that, right? Which is, one, to, as the instructor yourself, to really emphasize and think about the Friday deadline, or whatever your sort of initial deadline is, as the actual deadline. So on BlazeView, for example, you can go into the announcements and preset an announcement to go off the due date of a particular assignment, saying, hey, reminder, your assignment's due today at 5 o'clock. And so sort of emphasizing that the due date is the due date, and the grace period is just that. It's there for emergencies if you need it. The other thing that I did was I started to email students, which violated the no questions asked idea. But there was no sort of repercussion. I was just, if students were consistently turning things in closer at the end of the no excuse deadline, I said, hey, I just want to reach out. I noticed that you have a lot of your stuff kind of coming in on the weekend. I think it's important that you have work-life balance. And so, I want you to be able to get everything done by Friday. Is there something going on with your sort of schedule, or that's preventing you from meeting the actual deadline? And for the most part, it wasn't. It was just students who were treating the sort of extended deadline as the new deadline. And that gentle nudge to sort of push them towards the original deadline, the due date, ended up helping almost all of the students sort of get back on track there. So there's some sort of gentle nudges that you can do to sort of make that particular policy more effective. Okay, so let's highlight a few others. One nice thing that came out of this last year is that at VSU, if you're doing an in-person class, all of the classrooms now have video recording accessibility. And so you can, for example, record classes and then post them on your BlazeView page, which would allow students who had some sort of emergency situation where they couldn't attend class to watch the recording. And then you could assign, for example, attendance credit, right? If they were willing to submit sort of like a one-page sort of like, what were your big takeaways? How would you contribute to the discussion? Different things like that. And maybe not have it sort of penalize their attendance score. And you could offer, if you still want people to come to class, which I think is a good thing to do, that's still the main idea here. You could say up to, twice per semester, you can sort of have this no excuse option, right, for attendance. You could do something a little bit different where potentially you have them come into office hours, right? The same type of thing. Instead of submitting a one-page thing, you could say, come into office hours virtual or in person with, 2 big takeaways from the thing, or 2 questions that you were left wondering. And then use that as a sort of way to bring students back into the class, to account for attendance issues for when emergencies or something comes up. And here you're still holding them accountable for the material, but you're also not sort of penalizing them for something that sort of prevented them from being in the particular place at that particular time. a few more here. One faculty member wrote about doing a do-over Dropbox, which instead of having kind of like the ability to maybe turn everything in late, they just let them have one option to turn in anything, to redo an assignment that they maybe got poorly on during the semester, to revise and resubmit a project, and have it include a reflection on what happened and how to correct the behavior that prevented them from doing well in the first place. So it's a nice flexible grading policy for something that maybe went poorly. This fourth item I really like, is less about attendance than sort of like participation. But one thing I think that we've seen is that we've had a lot of students who sort of benefit from having a chat present when you teach, so that they can sort of ask questions. People who might feel uncomfortable asking questions or interrupting a class during a live session might feel more comfortable typing into a chat to ask for clarification on some point. And they notice that other students would tend to help out and answer sort of questions. And so you can kind of create this dialogue. And so one faculty member referenced, including an online chat to coincide even with the face-to-face class, to give students the option to sort of contribute to class discussion that way. So here are some ideas. There's more, and I welcome sort of your thoughts, but some guiding questions that we can sort of lean into is to think about, which of these options you might like to try and why, or potentially, if you've tried one of these sort of different strategies already, how it went, any lessons that you learned. I know I learned a lot about the grace period the last time I did this workshop, or maybe something that wasn't mentioned there that you've used and you liked it and why. So I'm going to go ahead and take a pause here, and hopefully Shipra, like that sort of gives a little bit more context in terms of what we're thinking about for policies. And Kiki, I welcome your feedback as well. But I know that the last thing I'll say is that it's difficult to put a one-size-fits-all policy out there, because I think that we're in different situations, and so it's important to kind of have these dialogues about sort of how we can sort of best move forward. But I'll leave it there and hopefully get some of your feedback here.
Yes, so I like the grace period idea. I was looking into day one program assignments, like for homework assignments, and they have all these settings where I can allow the grace period. So, and that doesn't harm me, because um, all these assignments will be auto graded. Now, so I'm okay with that as far as the students submit it by that, like the second deadline, I would say. Um, but I want to ask you a question. So I think what might happen is that if there are students, in that case, if there are students who still have any problems, or who are still missing assignments, I can probably send them a personal email to remind them. Like, how does that work? Because the thing is that I have a class of 100, so I'm not sure what would be the statistics of, like, students, how the students are gonna behave after pandemic. Their study habits and all those are, were all interrupted during this 1 year.
Great question. So I think there are some sort of specific things that you can do. I don't know exactly how you have your class set up if you're using BlazeView, but you can kind of send out a form email to a bunch of different students using like class list and BlazeView, which does a blind copy for all of your students. And you can send out a message like, hey, you are, select the students who have missed an assignment, and send out, one sort of form email rather than trying to individually send out. If you have hundreds of students, right? You can send out a reminder that's just like one form email, and then blind copy a bunch of students on it about reminding them because they're late on some assignment. But in my view, if you've built in a bunch of flexibility already into your course, then maybe you can't catch everyone, right? I don't think in a class with several hundred students you're going to have some students, no matter how much flexibility you add, that don't get the work done, and so I don't think that that's a reflection on you or on your course policies. I think that's just the nature of having really large classes. So one thing that I really like about using a flexible, using like a grace period, is coupling that with dropping your lowest score and then having sort of strict deadlines. And so it's okay to sort of have expectations that things are submitted by the end of your grace period. And then just providing that one other sort of safety net where like your lowest score in a particular category will get dropped. So if something really big does come up that prevents them from having it on time or during the grace period, then they're not completely out of luck in that situation. So that would be sort of my feedback there. Part of it is that's just going to be the nature of teaching a large class is you can't get all the students, but then there's other sort of things you can add on to a grace period to kind of round out that sort of policy and make it sort of hit more students, I think.
Yes, so I have a question here. The last classes I taught, I haven't taught here, but I've taught somewhere else. So I had these like grace periods. I also had the drop of like the minimum. I think out of 10 assignments, you can drop the lowest two. The lowest two means one you haven't submitted, or it could be two you haven't submitted. So you got a zero on that. You can drop it. So I had that, and I had like 4 exams where you can drop one lowest grade for the exam. So I had built in all those um, flexible things. But even then, at the end of the semester, my students like elsewhere, like they talk right amongst each other. So a CS, like a computer science major, I was talking to him, and he told me, "I heard you are very strict." I'm like, I don't know. After being so much flexible, what does that mean? Like how I could be more flexible.
I don't, I mean, from my perspective, that sounds great. That's like what I'm trying to, what you just described is what I'm trying to push people to do. I think that if one of the things highlighting the faculty members earlier who allowed students to turn everything in as long as it was in by the final, that was for me a really nice gesture at the time, but not sort of a sustainable policy either for the faculty member because it's taking on too much. But also similarly, it's not sort of building good habits for your students. And it prevents you from having sort of meaningful discussions because you'll end up with a bunch of students who are behind. So in terms of what you just described, I think is a good set of policies. And so I'm sorry that that you've ended up. I wonder if it was maybe your exams are just really hard, and it's not about your actual course policies themselves. It's just people think that you set high standards, but I think that that's fair. I think it's fair to set high standards and to one of the things that I said was you can be rigorous, right, and still have flexibility built in. So in terms of what you're describing, I think I think it sounds good to me, to be perfectly honest. I don't know, Kiki, if you want to chime in.
No, I like the ideas of the flexible late assignments and the do-over Dropbox, and also having the videos recorded, considering the state at hand that we're in case for emergencies, or even if we have to go to an emergency pullback and go back to virtual altogether.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that you have this flexibility too as an instructor, right? Like if you are sick or concerned, if you've come into contact with somebody with COVID, that it's totally reasonable to pull off and use this medium that we have set up available for you. It's not ideal if you're having an in-person class, but it's better than sort of canceling class, right? And so you have the luxury of if you feel good enough but you've been exposed perhaps to take that on yourself, right? And to say, hey, this week we're going to be doing class online because I don't want to risk exposing you. I think that that flexibility goes both ways, and I think that it's important to maintain both for yourselves and for your students.
Yes, good, good, good.
So So I have a question about that. Uh, in a lot of new faculty orientation, I heard the provost emphasizing the fact that if any students come to you and says that for any reason they need to go online, like they would do the class from home, don't do it. So that's true, right? I'm just confirming.
Um, I think there's a distinction here between what I'm trying to suggest, which is flexibility for one-off events versus flexibility to kind of transition your course. So I was at a few, not everything for new faculty orientation, but I was at a few things, and I know that they said, for example, that you can't unilaterally decide to take your course online. Um,
Right.
that has to go through the dean, right? And get approvals and different things like that. But I think like if you have a good, just as always was the case, if you're sick, don't come to class, right? Like don't risk that for your students. And you can create policies that allow that for your students for one-off type events, right? So if that's where I'm saying have one or two, or even in a full semester 3, right? Excused absences where they can watch a recording and then sort of demonstrate some other way that they're engaging with the class material, either by doing a short write-up or coming to virtual office hours, or some other sort of approach to have them demonstrate that they're sort of engaging with the material.
Okay.
Then that's fine for exceptions, right? But I don't think that I think what they were trying to say is you can't have students say, I need to take this class online and you need to provide like an online modality for me permanently, if that
And
answers your question, Shipra.
yeah, and then you also gave me a very good idea just now. So when I like for classes this semester, they are face to face, and I had my office hours face to face, and then it was like by appointment also. But just now I got this idea that during my office hours, I can be present online on maybe PSPU or Teams and invite my students to meet me online so that they don't have to waste their time to walk to my office if they don't want to.
Yeah, I also think that, I mean, this is something that I encourage. I know that, so my wife is actually new faculty here as well. And she told me that they kind of said you can't run all of your office hours fully online,
Mhm.
but you certainly can have that be part of the sort of, you know,
Right.
options.
So,
And I
yes,
think that
sorry.
that's
So, okay, go on. Yeah.
No, I don't know that that's true. So I'm sorry if that I don't want to spread misinformation about sort of specific policies that might have been a department policy. I also don't think that there's a ton of oversight. So I'm recording this. Maybe I'll have to cut that part out. But yeah, if you want to run,
No, no,
certainly at
no.
least make.
What I'm saying is that I will be in my office physically during my office hours, and I can also like in addition to that, I can also be online at the same time, so that if any students want, they can approach me online as well.
I
That's what
think
I'm
that's a
saying.
wonderful option, actually. And for some reason, I never thought of it. So I'm going to write that down right now. That's a great. So you're available in both mediums at the same
Right,
time.
exactly. Yes.
The only concern I have with that
Mhm.
is, I mean, just like we've all gotten better at doing high flex things, right? Dealing with people in person and online at the same time, is there might be a little bit of logistical challenges in terms of like making sure that you're muted. Like if you have somebody waiting, right, online in
Absolutely.
Teams or something,
Okay.
making sure that you're muted if you're talking to somebody in
Oh yeah,
person at the
that's a
same
good
time.
idea. I'll jot it
Um,
down.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. In my experience teaching, the only time you ever really get more than one student at a time is like right before an exam. So maybe you'll have more issues then. But rarely did I have like tons of student overlap with office hours. So I think
Yeah, but
on the
yeah,
regular
that was
basis,
a
that
good
probably
idea.
works fine. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good idea. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I love online office hours. I think it's both more effective for you as an instructor, but it's all like it's one of those things that's a great policy because it makes your life easier in a lot of ways. But it's also sort of more accessible for students, and especially this idea, Shipra, of being sort of you could drop by or drop in, right? Like come by the office or log in to sort of collaborate or Teams. and giving them those different options there, I think is wonderful. I know we're approaching the end of our time here, and I want to be mindful of the fact that we signed up for just 1 hour workshop here, but I want to open it up if there's any kind of last thoughts, any sort of key takeaways. Now would be an ideal time to share.
I like the idea of universal design for learning. And I did like the feedback about the flexible late assignments and the do-over drop box, because I do, if you're giving them a set syllabus and they have options, but you're also holding them accountable to stick to what's there. And it's flexibility for both the student and the instructor.
Great.
For me, I'm glad that I got the confirmation that what I was doing with the policies previously is good and is expected or appreciated. And also, I also like this idea of like being simultaneously present online as well as physically in my office during office hours, so that it just like I'm more approachable and students feel that they can ask for my help anytime they like.
Wonderful. Well, those are some great takeaways. I know I have some takeaways too. I really like this idea of both, being online and in-person office hours at the same time. And I know when I saw the do-over Dropbox, I thought that was a great idea as well, Kiki. So I'm glad that you liked that too. I want to thank you both for being so engaged in the workshop and sort of thinking through some different policy ideas. I want to let you know that myself and the instructional designers and the instructional technologists with the Center for E-Learning are available at your disposal. We'd love to help out. You'll be receiving an email from me asking for feedback. It's an anonymous feedback form that we have provided, and it also allows you to sort of create suggestions for other workshops that you might like to see. And that's actually where some of the workshops that we were doing this year, it comes directly out of sort of requests from faculty. So we welcome both sort of feedback on the workshops that we're doing, as well as ideas for future workshops for different things that you might like to see. So thank you both so much, and I appreciate your sort of contributions today.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you,
Thank you. Have a good
Kiki.
day.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you both.
Bye.
Bye.